Harry Truman was the 33rd President of the United States, serving from 1945 to 1953. A leader of the Democratic Party, he previously served as the 34th Vice President from January to April 1945 under Franklin D. Roosevelt, and as United States Senator from Missouri from 1935 to January 1945. Assuming the presidency after Roosevelt's death, Truman implemented the Marshall Plan to rebuild the economy of Western Europe and established both the Truman Doctrine and NATO to contain the expansion of the Soviet communism. He proposed numerous liberal domestic reforms, but few were enacted by the conservative coalition that dominated the Congress. Truman grew up in Independence, Missouri, and during the World War I fought in France as a captain in the field artillery. Returning home, he opened a haberdashery in Kansas City, Missouri, and was elected as a judge of Jackson County in 1922. Truman was elected to the United States Senate from Missouri in 1934. In 1940 to 1944, he gained national prominence as chairman of the Truman Committee, which was aimed at reducing waste and inefficiency in wartime contracts. Truman was elected vice president in 1944 and assumed the presidency following the death of Roosevelt. Not until he became president was Truman informed about the ongoing Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. Truman authorized the first and only use of nuclear weapons in war against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Truman's administration engaged in an internationalist foreign policy by working closely with British Prime Minister Clement Attlee. Truman staunchly denounced isolationism. He energized the New Deal coalition during the 1948 presidential election. Despite a divided Democratic Party and won a surprise victory against Republican Thomas E. Dewey that secured his own presidential term. Truman presided over the onset of Cold War in 1947. He oversaw the Benin Airlift and Marshall Plan in 1948. With the involvement of the US in the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, South Korea repelled the invasion by North Korea. Domestically, the post-war economic challenges such as strikes and inflation created a mixed reaction over the effectiveness of his administration. In 1948, he proposed Congress pass comprehensive civil rights legislation. Congress refused. So Truman issued Executive Order 9980 and Executive Order 9981, which prohibited discrimination in federal agencies and disintegrated the armed forces. Corruption in parts of the Truman administration became a major campaign issue in 1952 presidential election. Although the elections did not reach Truman personally, he was eligible for re-election in 1952, but weeks polls he decided not to run. Truman went into a retirement marked by funding of his presidential library and the publication of his memoirs. It was long thought that his retirement years were financially difficult for Truman, resulting in Congress establishing a pension for former presidents, but evidence eventually emerged that he amassed considerable wealth, some of it while still president. When he left office, Truman's administration was heavily criticized, though critical reassessment of his presidency has improved his reputation among historians and the general population. Truman was born in Lamar, Missouri on 8 May 1884, the oldest child of Johnson Anderson Truman and Martha Ellen Young Truman. He was named for his maternal uncle Harrison R. Young. His middle initial S is not an abbreviation of one particular name. Rather, it honors both his grandfathers Anderson Ship Truman and Solomon Young, a semi-common practice in the American South. A brother, John Vivian, was born soon after Harry, followed by sister Mary Jane. Truman's ancestry is primarily English with some Scots, Irish, German, and French. Truman was employed briefly in the mailroom of the Kansas City Star before making use of his business college experience to obtain a job as a timekeeper for construction crews on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, which required him to sleep in the workmen camps along the rail lines. Truman and his brother Vivian later worked as clerks at the National Bank of Commerce in Kansas City. Due to lack of funds for college, Truman considered attending the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York, which had no tuition, but he was refused an appointment because of poor eyesight. He enlisted in Missouri National Guard in 1905 and served until 1911 in the Kansas City-based Battery B, 2nd Missouri Field Artillery Regiment, in which he attained the rank of corporal. At his induction, his eyesight without glasses was unacceptable. 20 out of 50 in the right eye and 20 out of 400 in the left passed the standard for legal blindness. The second time he took the test, he passed by secretly memorizing the eye chart. He was described as 5 feet 10 inches tall, gray-eyed, dark-haired, and of light complexion. When the United States entered World War I on April 6, 1917, Truman rejoined Battery B, successfully recruiting new soldiers for expanding unit, for which he was elected as their first lieutenant. Before deployment to France, Truman was sent for training to Camp Dopin Fan, Fort Sill near Lawton, Oklahoma. When his regiment was federalized as the 129th Field Artillery, the regimental commander during its training was Robert M. Dunford, who later served as the Army's chief of field artillery. Truman recalled that he learned more practical, useful information from Dunford in 6 weeks than from 6 months of formal army instruction. And when Truman served as an artillery instructor, he consciously patterned his approach on Dunford's. Truman was honorably discharged from the army as a captain on May 6, 1919. In 1920, he was appointed a major in the Officers Reserve Corps. He became a lieutenant colonel in 1925 and a colonel in 1932. In the 1920s and 1930s, he commanded 1st Battalion, 379th Field Artillery, 102D Infantry Division. After promotion to colonel, Truman advanced to command of the same regiment. Truman was awarded a World War I Victory Medal with 2 battle clubs for St. Mihiel, Meuse, and Argonne, and a defensive sector clasp. He was also the recipient of the 2 Armed Forces Reserve Medals. After his wartime service, Truman returned to Independence, where he married Bess Wallace on 28 June 1919. The couple had one child, Margaret Mary Truman. After serving as the county judge, Truman wanted to run for governor or Congress, but Pendergast rejected his ideas. Truman then thought he might serve out of his career in some well-paying county in sinecure. Circumstances changed when Pendergast reluctantly backed him as the machine's choice in the 1934 Democratic primary election for the U.S. Senate from Missouri. After the Pendergast's first 4 choices had declined to run the primary, Truman defeated Congressman John J. Cochran and Jacob L. Milligan with the solid support of Jackson County, which was crucial to his candidacy. Also critical were the contacts he made statewide in his capacity as a county official, member of the Freemasons and military reservist, and member of the American Legion. In the general election, Truman defeated incumbent Republican Roscoe S. Patterson by nearly 20 percentage points in the continuing wave of pro-New Deal Democrats elected during the Great Depression. In the late 1940s, Truman traveled to various military bases. The West and profiteering he saw led him to use chairmanship of the Committee on Military Affairs Subcommittee on War Mobilization to start investigation into abuses while the nation prepared for war. A new special committee was set up under Truman to conduct a formal investigation. The White House supported this plan rather than whether a more hostile probe by the House of Representatives. The main mission of the committee was to expose and fight waste and corruption in the gigantic government wartime contracts. Roosevelt's advisors knew that Roosevelt might not live out a 4th term and that his vice president will very likely become the next president. Henry Wallace had served as Roosevelt's vice president for 4 years and he was popular on the left, but he was viewed as too far to the left and too friendly to labor for some of Roosevelt's advisors. The president and several of his confidants wanted to replace Wallace with someone more acceptable to Democratic Party leaders. Outgoing Democratic National Committee Chairman Frank C. Walker, incoming Chairman Hannigan, and Party Treasurer Edwin W. Pauley, Dong's party boss Ed Phelan, Chicago Mayor Edward Joseph Kelly, and lobbyist George E. Allen all wanted to keep Wallace off the ticket. Roosevelt told party leaders that he would accept either Truman or Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. After the White House, Truman replaced Roosevelt holdovers with old confidence. The White House was badly understaffed. With no more than a dozen aides, they could barely keep up with the heavy work flow of a greatly expanded executive department. Truman acted as his own chief of staff on a daily basis, as well as his own liaison with the Congress, a body he already knew very well. He was not well prepared to deal with the press and never achieved the jovial familiarity of FDR. Filled with latent anger about all the setbacks in his career, he bitterly mistrusted the journalists. He saw them as enemies lying in wait for his next careless miscue. Truman was a very hard worker, often to the point of exhaustion, which left him testy, easily annoyed, and on the verge of appearing unpresidential or petty. In terms of major issues, he discussed them in depth with top advisors. He mastered the details of the federal budget as well as anyone. Truman was a poor speaker reading a text. However, his visible anger made him an effective stump speaker. denouncing his enemies as his supporters hollered back at him, "Give them hell, Harry." On his first full day, Truman told reporters, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know if you fellas ever had a load of A fall on you, but when they told me what happened yesterday, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Truman asked all the members of Roosevelt's cabinet to remain in place, but he soon replaced almost all of them, especially with old friends from his Senate days. Truman benefited from a honeymoon period from the success in defeating Nazi Germany in Europe, and the nation celebrated the VE Day on May 8, 1945, on his 61st birthday. The end of World War II was followed by an easy transition from a war to a peacetime economy. The cost of war effort had been enormous, and Truman was intent on diminishing military services as quickly as possible to curtail the government's military expenditures. The effect of demobilization on the economy was unknown. Proposals were met with skepticism and resistance, and fears existed that the nation would slide back into depression. In Roosevelt's final years, Congress began to reassert legislative power, and Truman faced a congressional body where Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats formed a powerful conservative coalition voting bloc. The New Deal has greatly strengthened labor unions, and they formed a major base of support for Truman's Democratic Party. The Republicans, working with big business, made it their highest priority to weaken those unions. Unions had been promoted by the government during the war and tried to make their gains permanent through large-scale strikes in major industries. Meanwhile, price controls were slowly ending and inflation was soaring. Truman's response to the widespread dissatisfaction was generally seen as ineffective. The president's approval rating dropped from 82% in the polls in January 1946 to 52% by June. This dissatisfaction led to large Democratic losses in 1946 midterm elections, and Republicans took control of Congress for the first time since 1930. When Truman dropped to 32% in the polls, Democratic Arkansas Senator William Fulbright suggested that Truman resign. The president said he did not care what Senator Albright said. As he readied for the 1948 election, Truman made clear his identity as a Democrat in the New Deal tradition. Advocating for national health insurance and repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act, he broke with the New Deal by initiating an aggressive civil rights program which he termed as a moral priority. His economic and social vision constituted a broad legislative agenda that came to be called the Fair Deal. Truman's proposals were not well received by Congress, even with renewed Democratic majorities in Congress after 1948. The Solid South rejected civil rights as those states still enforced segregation. Only one of the major Fair Deal bills, the Housing Act of 1949, was ever enacted. Many of the New Deal programs that persisted during the Truman's presidency have since received minor improvements and extensions. As a Wilsonian internationalist, Truman supported Roosevelt's policy in favor of the creation of the United Nations and included Eleanor Roosevelt on the delegation of the first UN General Assembly. With the Soviet Union expanding its sphere of influence through Eastern Europe, Truman and his foreign policy advisors took a hard line against the USSR. In this emerged US public opinion, which quickly came to believe the Soviets were intent upon world domination. On January 24, 1948, the Soviet Union blocked access to the three western held sectors of Berlin. The Allies had not negotiated a deal to guarantee supply of the sectors deep within the Soviet-occupied zone. The commander of the US occupation zone in Germany, General Lucius D. Clay, proposed sending a large armored column across the Soviet zone to western Berlin with instruction to defend itself if it was stopped or attacked. Truman believed this would entail an unacceptable risk of war. He approved Ernest Bavin's plan to supply the blockade city by air. Truman had long taken an interest in the history of the Middle East and was sympathetic to Jews who sought to re-establish their ancient homeland in mandatory Palestine. As a senator, he announced support for Zionism. In 1943, he called for homeland for those Jews who survived the Nazi regime. However, State Department officials were reluctant to offend the Arabs, who were opposed to the establishment of a Jewish state in the large region long populated and dominated culturally by Arabs. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal warned Truman of the importance of Saudi Arabian oil in another war. Truman replied he would decide his policy on the basis of justice and not oil. US diplomats with experience in the region were opposed, but Truman told them he had few Arabs among his constituents. Under his predecessor Frank D. Roosevelt, the Fair Employment Practices Committee was created to address racial discrimination in employment, and in 1946, Truman created the President's Committee on Civil Rights on June 29, 1947. Truman became the first president to address the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The speech took place at the Lincoln Memorial during the NAACP convention and was carried nationally on radio. In that speech, Truman laid out the need to end discrimination, which would be advanced by the first comprehensive presidentially proposed civil rights legislation. Truman on civil rights and human freedom also declared it as citizen full freedom for fear. In 1948, Truman delivered a formal message to Congress requesting adoption of his 10-point program to secure civil rights, including anti-lynching, voter rights, and the elimination of segregation. No political act since the Compromise of 1877, argued biographer Taylor Branch, so profoundly influenced race relations. In a sense, it was a repeal of 1877. In 1948, presidential election is remembered for Truman's stunning come from behind victory. In the spring of 1948, Truman's public approval rating stood at 6%, and the president was nearly universally regarded as incapable of winning the general election. At the 1948 Democratic National Convention, Truman attempted to unify the party with a vague civil rights plank in the party platform. His intention was to assuage the internal conflicts between the northern and southern wings of his party. Events overtook his efforts. A sharp address given by Mayor Hubert Humphrey of Minneapolis, as well as the local political interest of a number of urban bosses, convinced the convention to adopt a stronger civil rights plank, which Truman approved wholeheartedly. Truman delivered an aggressive acceptance speech attacking the 88th Congress, which Truman called the Do-Nothing Congress, and promising to win the election and make these Republicans like it. Truman's second inauguration was the first ever televised nationally. The Soviet Union's atomic bomb project progressed much faster than had been expected, and they detonated their first bomb on August 29, 1949. Over the next several months, there was an intense debate that split the US government, military, and scientific communities regarding whether to proceed with the development of the far more powerful hydrogen bomb. The debate touched on matters from technically feasible to strategic value to the morality of creating a massive destructive weapon. On January 31, 1950, Truman made the decision to go forward on the grounds that if the Soviets could make an H-bomb, the United States must do so as well and stay ahead in the nuclear arms race. The development achieved fruition with the first US H-bomb test on October 31, 1952, which was officially announced by Truman on January 7, 1953. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean army under Kim Il-sung invaded South Korea, starting the Korean War. In the early weeks of the war, the North Koreans easily pushed back their southern counterparts. Truman called for a naval blockade of Korea, only to learn that due to budget cutbacks, the US Navy could not enforce such a big measure. The escalation of the Cold War was highlighted by Truman's approval of NSC 68, a secret statement of foreign policy. It called for tripling the defense budget and globalization and militarization of containment policy, whereby the United States and its NATO allies would respond militarily to actual Soviet expansion. The document was drafted by Paul Nitz, who consulted state and defense officials, and was formally approved by President Truman as the official national strategy after the war began in Korea. It called for partial mobilization of the US economy to build armaments faster than the Soviets. The plan called for strengthening Europe, weakening the Soviet Union, and building up the United States both militarily and economically. In August 1948, Whittaker Chambers, a former spy for the Soviets and a senior editor at Time magazine, testified before the House of American Activities Committee. He said an underground communist network had worked inside the US government during the 1930s, of which Chambers had been a member along with Al-Jahis until recently a senior State Department official. Chambers did not allege any spying during the Truman presidency. Although he is denied the allegations, he was convicted in January 1950 for perjury for denials under oath. In 1948, Truman ordered an addition to the exterior of the White House, a second-floor balcony in the south portico, which came to be known as the Truman balcony. The addition was unpopular. Some said it spoiled the appearance of the south facade, but it gave the first family more living space. Meanwhile, structural deterioration and a near imminent collapse of the White House led to a comprehensive dismantling and rebuilding of the building's interior from 1949 to 1952. A secretarial engineering investigation during 1948 deemed it unsafe for occupancy. Truman, his family, and the entire resident staff were located across the street into Blair House during the renovations. As the Neva West Wing, including the Oval Office, remained open, Truman walked to and from his work across the street each morning and afternoon. In response to labor stroke management impasse arising from bitter disagreements over wage and price control, Truman instructed his Secretary of Commerce Charles W. Sawyer to take control of a number of the nation's steel mills in April 1952. Truman cited his authority as a commander-in-chief and the need to maintain an uninterrupted supply of steel for munitions for the war in Korea. The Supreme Court found Truman's action unconstitutional, however, and reversed the order in a major separation of powers decision. Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co. v. Sawyer 1952. The 6-3 decision, which held that Truman's assertion of authority was too vague and was not rooted in any legislative action by Congress, was delivered by a court composed entirely of justices appointed by either Truman or Roosevelt. The higher court's reversal of Truman's order was one of the notable defeats of his presidency. In 1950, the Senate, led by Estes Carver, investigated numerous charges of corruption among senior administration officials, some of whom received the fur coats and deep freezers in exchange for favors. A large number of employees of Internal Revenue Bureau, today the IRS, were accepting bribes. 166 employees either resigned or were fired in the 1950s, with many soon facing indictment. When Attorney General J. Howard McGrath fired the special prosecutor in early 1952 for being too zealous, Truman fired McGrath. Truman submitted a reorganization plan to reform the IRB. Congress passed it, but corruption was a major issue in the 1952 presidential election. A 1947 report by the Truman administration titled "To Secure These Rights" presented a detailed 10-point agenda of civil rights reforms. Speaking about a report, international developments have to be taken into account with the UN Charter being passed in 1945. The question of whether international human rights law could be applicable also on an inner land basis became crucial in the United States. Though the report acknowledged such a part was not free from controversy in the 1940s in the United States, it nevertheless raised the possibility for the UN Charter to be used as a legal tool to combat racial discrimination in the United States. From 1947 until 1989, world affairs were dominated by Cold War, in which the US and its allies faced the Soviet Union and its allies. There was no large-scale fighting, but instead, several local civil wars as well as the ever-present threat of the catastrophic nuclear war. In 1951, the United States ratified the 22nd Amendment, making a president ineligible for election for a third term or for election to a second full term after serving more than 2 remaining years of a term of a previously elected president. The latter clause did not apply to Truman's situation in 1952 because of a grandfather clause exempting the incumbent president. Before being elected as Jackson County judge, Truman had earned little money and was in debt from the failure of his haberdashery. His election as a senator in 1934 carried with it a salary of $10,000, about $210,000 in 2022, high for the time, but the need to maintain 2 homes with one expensive Washington, Margaret Truman's college expenses and contributions to the support of needy relatives left the Trumans little extra money. He likely had around $7,500 in cash and government bonds when nominated for vice president. Truman's predecessor, Frank D. Roosevelt, had organized his own presidential library, but legislation to enable future presidents to do something similar had not been enacted. Truman worked to garner private donations to build a presidential library, which he donated for the federal government to maintain and operate, a practice adopted by his successors. Truman supported Adlai Stevenson's second bid for the White House in 1956. Although he had initially favored Democratic Governor Avril Harriman of New York, he continued to campaign for Democratic senatorial candidates for many years. After a fall in his home in late 1964, Truman's physical condition declined. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Medicare bill at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum and gave the first 2 Medicare cards to Truman and his wife Bess to honor the former president's fight for government health care while in office. On December 5, 1972, Truman was admitted to Kansas City Research Hospital and Medical Center with pneumonia. He developed multiple organ failure, fell into a coma, and died at 7:50 a.m. on December 26 at the age of 88. Best Truman opted for a simple private service at the library rather than a state funeral in Washington. A week after the funeral, foreign dignitaries and Washington officials attended a memorial service at Washington National Cathedral. Best Truman died in 1982 and was buried next to her husband, Harry S. Truman Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri. When he left office in 1953, Truman was one of the most unpopular chief executives in history. His job approval rating of 22% in the Gallup poll of February 1952 was lower than Richard Nixon's 24% in August 1974. The month that Nixon resigned, the American public feeling towards Truman grew steadily warmer with the passing years, as early as 1962. A poll of 75 historians conducted by Arthur M. Schleicher Sr. ranked Truman among the near-great presidents. The period followed his death consolidated a partial rehabilitation of his legacy among both historians and members of the public. Truman died when the nation was consumed with crises in Vietnam and Watergate, and his death brought a new wave of attention to his political career. In early and mid-1970s, Truman captured the popular imagination much as he had in 1948, this time emerging as a kind of political folk hero, a president who was thought to exemplify integrity and accountability. Many observers felt was lacking in the Nixon White House. This public reassessment of Truman was aided by the popularity of a book of reminiscences which Truman had told to journalist Mele Miller beginning in 1961, with the agreement that they will not be punished until after Truman's death. In 1956, Truman traveled to Europe with his wife. In Britain, he received an honorary degree in civil law from Oxford University and met with Winston Churchill. In 1959, he was given a 50-year award by the Masons, recognizing his long-standing involvement. He was initiated on February 9, 1909 into Belton Freemasonry Lodge in Missouri. In 1911, he helped establish a Grandview Lodge, and he served as his first worshipful master. In September 1940, during his Senate re-election campaign, Truman was elected Grand Master of the Missouri Grand Lodge of Freemasonry. Truman said later that the Masonic election assured his victory in the general election. In 1945, he was made a 33-degree Sovereign Grand Inspector General and an honorary member of the Supreme Council at the Supreme Council AASR Saturn Jurisdiction Headquarters in Washington, D.C. Truman was also a member of Sons of the American Revolution and a card-carrying member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Two of his relatives were Confederate soldiers.